In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on threats. Threats concern direct perception, be it the threat is perceived and or existing to what is not only perceived, yet actually, factually, probabilistically surpassed a rational expectation as to meet a rational expectation, yet also in some conditions provide just cause and or excuse to excuse behavior that may seem exaggerated and or more to be appear paranoid, yet is not paranoid in terms of a concern for a really true threat. Meaning that, be it some threats are perceived and or actually factually exist in terms of causing psychological distress within the person, means that there are certain subjectivo-objectivo relationships influencing mind-body connections in relation to the perception of a threat, not necessarily that harm is done, yet that future-oriented harm is being perceived in relation to what may most likely occur and or operate as a byproduct of, be it engaging in certain risky activities and or the conducts of another and or some more precarious situations, perhaps caused by weather conditions. For example, walking on a sidewalk during the winter, close to the spring season, or maybe during different days in the winter where it might be a little bit warmer, and you're walking under a skyscraper with icicles that could fall and cause a concussion, be it hits you, or fatal injury. So there's a threat in terms of the perceived risk. One may better avoid the risk by taking the other side of the street or moving a safe distance from the perimeter of the skyscraper to avoid the radius in which one would be more likely to be directly and or indirectly impacted by the falling icicle. This does not mean that the harm and or causations that would otherwise cause harm and or inflict injury upon a person need to exist to constitute this threat. Only the rational, meaningful concern and or rational experience of, be it anxiety that's appropriate, proportional to the psychological distress one is attempting to mediate in relation to the existing subjectivo-objectivo relaçãonavios connected to distinct conductivities within mind-body connections. There are existing domain-specific mind-body connections associated with distinct threats, meaning that a threat in relation to, maybe it's one engaging in foreseeable risky behaviors. For example, if somebody wants to climb a mountain without having the appropriate gear, one may look for a way to prevent injury, assessing different stones and or distinct areas in the locality to prior existing brainstorm the appropriate route that, be it somebody is climbing that mountain, had somebody taken a route with less meaningful options in terms of being able to appropriately climb the mountain, would more likely find oneself in a position where the risks are outweighing the benefits to climbing the mountain, putting the individual at more greater risk for foreseeable harm and or injury, causing the perceived threat within the situation, taking the step-by-step initiative to plan out a more safer climbing route would be more meaningful to be able to address the underlying certain existing meaningful conditional criteria in association to satisfying certain underlying psychological needs, appropriate to alleviate and or prevent unnecessary suffering, future-oriented. Threats are harmful to an individual's not only subjective well-being, yet one's mind-body connections associated with physical and or psychological health, amongst physical and or psychological well-being, directly associated from one's subjective experiences, influencing the subjective well-being of an individual, impacting directly and or indirectly mind-body connections associated with the threat that may activate within mind-body connections the trigger for a stress response, releasing various neurotransmitters, including the stress hormone cortisol, amongst norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are exciting the mind-body connections, not to mean that an individual is excited, yet to mean that there is increased arousal within stimulating the body, increasing blood flow, pupil dilation, and sweaty palms to prepare the body for distinct proactive activity to be able to appropriately address the potential threats in relation to domain-specific mind-body connections of most meaningful concern. Threats are always ingested within direct perception, meaning that a threat is inherently perceptual. It could not otherwise exist. Yet, the threat may not be perceived and still be a threat, yet it does not have the same, as it exists within mind-body connections, constitution as threatening the mind of an individual as to constitute a threat within the sense it is perceived as a threat by the individual and or actually factually constituted as a threat to that individual, instead of it being a threat another individual perceives to be a threat. This is meaningful as often we tend to experientially encounter threats such as this on a daily basis, be it that you have ever signed a waiver for something. The threats are perceived by the expert or whomever had created that waiver prior existing to you, and you may not even have recognized and or appreciated the full severity of the threat in relation to the actually factually existing threats, foreseeable future injury and or harm may be more likely to occur and or at elevated risk to occur, meaning that one whom is operating negligently may not fully appreciate the risks, weighing the risks and benefits existing prior to engaging in certain conducts, and engages in that conducts lacking the perception of a serious threat, meaning that the negligence, which may itself lead to injury, is duly, be it unduly, causing injury, yet justified in terms of constituting the negligence in terms of an individual whom is negligent in terms of lacking the responsible conduct to more carefully and deliberately evaluate the appropriate risks to cultivate the appropriate meaningful concern, not necessarily to increase psychological distress within one's being, having harmful, potential detrimental effects on mind-body connections amongst subjective well-being, causing future-oriented ill health associated with negative physical and or psychological health, amongst worse outcomes for one's physical and or psychological well-being, directly and or indirectly affecting one's subjective well-being. Associated with one's direct perception, causing the transformations within subjective well-being, be it one had engaged more appropriate assessments, could take the foreseeable step-by-step appropriate conduct to prevent the future-oriented injury and or harm amongst other potential threats, to not have to experience psychological distress, meaning that threat is not always associated with psychological distress, more the potential to experience psychological distress being more probabilistically likely to occur in the case of not just perceiving the possible threat, more to mean that one is actually experiencing threat. And threat is directly associated with the psychological distress of an individual in the case where one is experiencing, not just perceiving, a really true threat. For example, somebody who has a knife and who has literally threatened to use that knife, and maybe also swinging that knife about, is a threat to that individual and would most likely elicit psychological distress within an individual's mind-body connections, distinct from one merely thinking about an individual whom seems a little bit off and or might have a psychiatric disorder or illness such as schizophrenia, who might become, in the next subsequent moment, erratic and or a serious threat from some more minor symptoms that are less threatening, experiencing no immediate psychological distress, yet some meaningful concern. Meaning that threat, prior to engaging psychological distress, tends to also exist in terms of meaningful concern that's more appropriate to mitigating and or preventing future-oriented threats and or injury and or harm from the perception of threat. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. If you link to this episode.